Good evening. Hello, everyone. Bienvenidos. Benvingut. There's still a few more seats up front for anyone in the back. Hello, my name is Ann Quito. I'm a journalist, design critic, and a professor at Elisava. Welcome to the third edition of the Elisava Master Talks, a lecture series featuring world-renowned experts from various facets of the creative industry. Thanks to Elisava and D-Hub, these lectures remain free and open to all. Truly a gift to the city, so bring a neighbor, your parents, your lovers, your friends next time, no? For those who missed the first two speakers this year, the fascinating Norwegian smell researcher and artist Cecil Tolas and the mindful Japanese interaction designer Yosuke Oshigome, we also publish post-lecture podcasts available now on Spotify and on the Elisava website. All right, so judging from this crowd, tonight's lecture is a particularly special one, maybe a historic one. Well, with great pleasure, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Llisa Demetrios, who joins us from California. The last few days have been a bit stressful for her family and many residents of California, you might imagine. The iconic Eames house, known to architects in the audience as case study number 8, sits on the bluff in the fire-ravaged Pacific Palisades neighborhood of LA. We hear that the house is mercifully unharmed from the devastating wildfires as of today. But we're so grateful to Llisa for making the journey under these extraordinary circumstances. Llisa is the youngest granddaughter of the design legends Ray and Charles Eames. She is the chief curator of the Eames Institute for Infinite Curiosity, a sunny paradise of prototypes and some 40,000 design objects in Richmond, California. She began her career at the Mies van der Rohe archive at MoMA and has since dedicated herself to helping nurture her grandparents' astounding legacy. In thinking about how to frame tonight's lecture, I struggled to encapsulate the outsized legacy of Ray and Charles Eames, who are, quite simply, the most influential American designers of the mid-century and beyond. You've sat on their chairs, perhaps seen their films, read their books, maybe an exhibition about the mythic Eames office. But Llisa, in her generosity, says she delights in introducing her grandparents to audiences who may have never, ever heard of them. So tonight serves as a primer straight from the source. A little story about Llisa. This is her first time in Barcelona. Okay? Soon after she arrived, we took a little walk. Now, after a brief salute and awestruck glance at Sagrada Familia, we continued up Avenida Gaudí and ended up at the modernist marvel Sant Pau. Confronted with the many Art Nouveau baubles at this complex by Montaner, at Barcelona's old public hospital, Llisa, of all things, fixated on the grout. On the grout. La lechada, is that right? Lietada, in Catalan. The humble substance used to protect and connect these great tiles. I thought, protect and connect is truly what she does best. She is brilliant at this. It also made me think of the famous Eames maxim. Eventually, everything connects. People, ideas, objects. The quality of the connections is the key to quality per se. Llisa is a master at making connections. I encourage you to write down your questions or thoughts. We shall take some questions in the very end. But for now, will you please help me give a rousing Barcelona-style welcome to our guest speaker, the one and only Llisa Demetrios.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I was absolutely astonished and delighted at just the materials. I'm all about materials, which is why I think I loved becoming an archivist. I grew up in a family of makers, and my parents felt like I had enough art and design in my life that I wasn't allowed to major that in university. I went to Yale, so I majored in museum studies, how to take care of the objects. What I always keep coming back to with my grandparents' work is that it's how they made something. It's the questions that they asked, not just the object itself. And so you'll hear me talk about the origins of the Eames Institute of Infinite Curiosity was when we were loaning objects from my mother's collection, and people kept thinking what we would do next with them. Were there ways to share it digitally and physically? And so that really started at my mother's home up in Petaluma. And then we created a space over in Richmond, California, which is just across the bay, where we could start sharing these objects in person as well as online. Now, when the Eames Institute first opened, we had planned to open in person. However, COVID had hit, so we went digital, and we created a website. But at Richmond, what's exciting is now we are able to share the collection in person, and I do give the public tours. And I think what's really interesting is it's their boundless curiosity. It's the way, as I said, that they were constantly iterating and prototyping are things we can still do today and learn from. As I like to say, as great as my grandparents were as designers, they were even more incredible as just grandparents sharing whatever they were working on. I thought everyone's grandparents made films like Powers of 10 or multi-screen presentations for our visits. They kept meticulous notes when each of us 5 grandchildren visited. In fact, what they would do is they knew exactly which films we had seen, where we had gone out to dinner, where we had spent time, so that the next time we visited, they knew what new to offer or what we might want to see again. And for me, I'm a third-generation sculptor on the other side of my family. I'm a bronze sculptor. And it was just so encouraging that Ray and Charles would always encourage me to make my scale models and to weld and build in bronze. In fact, they said to me, you need to be able to use every tool as well, if not better, than the person you hire, or you won't know if they're doing a good job. And as a woman sculptor in the 1990s, that was very important, and that was great, great advice. And there's a wonderful quote, "I don't believe in this gifted few concept, just in people doing things that they are really interested in doing. They have a way of getting good at it." So that's what, for Ray and Charles, they encouraged all 5 of us grandchildren to pursue whatever we wanted, but not to just talk about it, but to really do it. And for me, it was the sculpture. Maybe they have a question. One of my favorite memories of spending time with them. Can you hear me? Should I just keep talking? Okay. One of my earliest memories, people often say, "Lisa, what's your first memory of spending time with your grandparents?" And what it is going out to dinner with them. Venice, California is very close to the beach. It's getting louder. Okay, I'll just keep going. So it's going out to dinner. We're coming back from dinner. It's only 4 blocks away. And Charles turns to me and he says, "What did you think of dinner?" Now, it was borscht. I love borscht now. But when I was 8 years old, I did not like it. So we're walking back and he asked me, "What did you think of dinner?" I was quite honest. I said I didn't like it very much. Do you know what he said to me? "Well, how would you have done things differently?" He's like, "What would you have done with those borscht ingredients?" He's like, "I know you like mashed potatoes. You could have made potatoes and used the butter and such." So I'm thinking about all the things you can make with borscht ingredients. There's not many things, but we had a whole conversation about this. The next block, he says to me, "Why was it borscht tonight? Was that all that was at the farmer's market? Is that somebody's favorite dish? Did somebody read about it?" So we had a whole conversation about that too. When we got back to the office, I felt very empowered as an 8-year-old. I was like, I knew I could complain about something, but I just had to have a better option. Now, much later in my life, did I realize that's not just a great design lesson, it's a great life lesson. Now, there was an exhibit in Oakland in 2018. It had started at the Barbican in London. Over 400 objects were borrowed from my family, and it traveled, and it ended in Oakland. So we invited all the docents at the museum to come to the ranch, which is where I was living at the time, and to come hear stories like I'm sharing with you tonight. And the next time I went to the museum, when the exhibit had opened, one of the docents came running over to me. And she said, "Lisa, your borscht story worked." I said, "Great, how?" She said, "Well, the next time my grandchildren complained about their salads," I said, "How would you do it differently?" And she said, "It turns out they don't like raw mushrooms." And so now they're opening, I think with Ray and Charles's work, it's about opening doors to ideas. And that's what we are doing today. This is their office. This was their office at 901 Washington Boulevard in Venice, California. Ray, as you might remember, came from painting, and Charles came from architecture. You might surprise you, they really considered themselves tradesmen. It was either a problem that they were solving for somebody else or a problem that they wanted to solve for themselves. They really believed that design was a method of action to improve people's lives. And so that's really the part that we share at the Eames Institute. And everything that they did, I would say, whether it's a graphic, it's a short film, architecture, it's all about communicating an idea. It's whatever the idea that they want to communicate, in which form it would best take shape in. Now, in this next picture, you're starting to see some interiors of the office. You can see in this one space, they're working on a piece of furniture, a graphic. They're having a photo shoot in the back. The reason Ray and Charles loved working with chairs is they called it architecture you could hold in your hand, because you can control all the parts. You're not waiting for anybody. So they could build the prototype, they could start scaling it up. And then also what's interesting is, you know, when they started working with Herman Miller, people were not familiar with these materials getting used for the production of furniture, whether it's wood, plastic, fiberglass, aluminum, or wire rod. And so they actually start creating a division at Herman Miller to test the quality of the furniture. So do you know when like a sandbag hits a chair 10,000 times? They're creating that division at Herman Miller to show these pieces will last. And they're experimenting all of this in their office. On the left is Ray and Charles working on the film Toccata for Toy Trains. But on the right is a scene for obviously a luncheon for some special guest that was probably visiting at the time. What I love is I recognize about 12 objects that we have today at Richmond that we can share in new ways. Now, what happened was, Charles passed away in 1978, Ray passed away in 1988, 10 years to the day, August 21st. Before they passed, we knew a lot of material, particularly two-dimensional, would be going to the Library of Congress. And so my mother was asked by Ray, please sell where the office was. I can go backwards. Please sell where the office was, because she says it's going to need a retrofit. And in California, that means they put steel beams in, and it changed the interior of the space. And she said it took us 35 years to get it the way we liked it, so please sell the building, and if you can, take care of the Eames house. So, as my mom liked to say, the trucks came from the Library of Congress. Over 750,000 slides, prints, and photographs were shipped to the Library of Congress. And when she went back inside, she felt like nothing had been taken. There was so much material. So for her, our mom really wanted to bring it all. Most people come to Ray and Charles's work through furniture, but she wanted them to also learn about those graphics, the films, all the other things that they also did. So she bundled it up to San Francisco, and then there was an earthquake in 1989. That's why she created this building. This is the house. And then this was the barn, working with William Turnbull, who designed many Sea Ranch buildings, which is just a couple hours north of us in Petaluma. What was wonderful is he's used to creating spaces that are very flexible. You could be archiving, you could also be doing your own work, and then also entertaining. And as I said, I'm the youngest of 5, so always somebody was visiting at the same time. My mom is actually a wonderful designer herself. This is one of her designs. She also had a great sense of humor. If you look at the panels, do you see that those are sun patterns, right? So she called that a solar panel. And so this is, as she put it, getting a suntan. It's getting rusty, being out in the sun. When she built the place, she did want to have solar panels, collect water from the rooftops, all these things. But it just wasn't the time. Now, today, it's very easy to do that. But 30 years ago was a little more challenging. This is the interior of the space. This is in the gallery. What I love is when Ray and Charles were first making chairs and thinking about it, they would call this designing seating, this lounge chair and ottoman. They would not call that designing a chair. Because if you call that designing a chair, you're eliminating the ottoman before you've even thought of it. So this is all about seating. And each of these chairs is for a unique experience. Whether you're at a drafting table, you're also working at a desk, you're having those low back, the ones with the low back, the blue and the black, or for La Fonda restaurant, where Alexander Girard, he didn't want the backs of the chairs to be taller than the table, so when you took pictures of his restaurant, you only saw tables of food, not backs of chairs. So each one has its own unique reason. And it really was not until the lounge chair and ottoman that Herman Miller said to them, you can design anything you want. And for Ray and Charles, that was actually more of a challenge. There was no constraint to work with. And so it was really for them, do you know what they thought about? What if you can make a lounge chair out of a first baseman's mitt in baseball in the United States? And so what would that feel like to sit in it? And that's why it became the lounge chair and ottoman here. There was a great quote by Charles. We've always been aware of not even attempting to solve the problem of how people should sit, but of rather arbitrarily accepting the way people do sit and operating within that framework. When Ray and Charles made their first molded plywood chairs, they actually made a few of them with 3 legs. And they thought, this is wonderful. It's very stable on the ground, until they tested it. And what they noticed is nobody could get out of that chair without falling. And so that's why they said, we're not trying to teach anybody how to sit. We're going to work with how they sit. For me, as I started to immerse myself in the material, we started to try to make little connections here. So if you look at the green chair, to the right is a harlequin pattern. Do you notice the edge is torn? That's what they're starting to notice, Ray and Charles, that the cloth edges are getting worn out. It's why it becomes a rubberized edge on the next one, so it will last longer for the person who sits in the chair. So really for, I think, my mom and me, as we were sharing this at the ranch, people would hear about this through word of mouth. What we realized what we were sharing was, I call it design with a small d. It's the process of how they got to the finished piece. Design with a capital D is the finished piece that goes into production that you sit at the dining room table or at the airport. Here, you can see in the collection, it includes photographs, correspondence, letters, all kinds of materials. It's not just chairs. And that's what makes it exciting, too. sometimes people say, to me, what is it like? And I said, I just keep learning. I've been around this material for 30 years. It's Charles liked to say, unlike Keats, who said that knowing about the rainbow shatters its beauty, I feel that knowledge about an object can only enrich your feeling for the object itself. It's what Anne was saying. Eventually, everything connects. I really think with their work, one chain reaction will learn and lead to another chain reaction. That's a picture of my mom. I grew up with my mom always being asked in interviews what it was like to live at the Eames house. And she'd always look at the interviewer and say, I didn't live at the Eames house the way I think you did. She said, because I was 16 when they bought the parts, and in 3 years, I was going off to college and getting married by the time I was, sorry, it's a little distracting. It's 3 years before they got the parts. Oh my goodness. It's 3 years by the time they got the parts, and I was going off to college and getting married, and I was 19. But she said, because they had not received the parts, every weekend they would go out and spend time in the meadow on the property to get to know it. I don't know if you've ever heard of that expression. Often with farms and gardening, you don't plan anything for the first year. You see what already grows. So for Ray and Charles spending every weekend for a couple of years with my mom, they realized their favorite part of the property, because they're shooting archery, they're having picnics, is the meadow. And the way the house was designed at that point was to come out of the hillside and land in the middle of the meadow. Ray said they were going to make the classic architect's mistake, which was to ruin the meadow with the building that you add. So what I loved is they used design to solve the problem. They realized they could rotate the house 90 degrees, set it into the hillside, and then they get to have a house in a meadow. She said she got to be there for that weekend as they figured that out. So that's why I like having my mom's picture here. I love the Polaroid cameras because that's one of the short films they put me in. As I said, they were incredible. They just included you in whatever they were working on, and you didn't realize it till much later how extraordinary the experience was. And this is another, I'm wanting just to share, these are the words that I grew up with. The most important thing is that you love what you are doing, and the second, that you're not afraid where your next idea will lead. And I hope you all take that to heart. Now at this point, after college, I did work in the Mies van der Rohe archive for about 3 years. At that time, the way you shared an archive was by publications. Today, we can share it digitally, physically, and also do exhibits, but that's how you did it back then. And that was the project I was working on, 14,000 drawings. Now, these drawers are from my grandparents' office called the graphics room. It was my favorite room. I really thought rainbows came out of this drawers because there were drawers like this. And as a maker, I love seeing the materials that they used in all their work and in the graphics. And also, their fingerprints are on all of these pieces. And I'm just so lucky that my mother decided to save everything. There were other drawers like this. I remember this drawer. Now, you can't quite read it on the edge, but it says on the edge here, please sharpen pencils so the numbers can be read. There's all these systems within systems at the office. And so there's a little number in the drawer so you know which one to put it back in. For Ray and Charles, they never wanted to make a chair once. Everything was a system of how to make a chair 100,000 times. So to do that, there requires many efficiencies. And that's what I see as reflected in the material that they kept at their office. Now, this is one of the most important things I share with you today. Has anyone seen this graphic before? If so, raise your hand. Oh, awesome. A lot of people haven't. All right. In the late 1960s, Ray and Charles participated in an exhibit in Paris, and the curator, she asked all the architects participating in this exhibit to explain their design process. This is how Ray and Charles explained their design process. So the first circle is what Ray and Charles wanted to accomplish. The second was their client. But there was always a third circle, society as a whole. And you had to focus on the part that overlapped for all three. So that means when they're designing a leg splint for the war effort, it's a way to help the war effort without hurting anybody. When they work on the National Aquarium Project, it's a way to get people to care about something they can't see, which is underwater, and what they called making the invisible visible. For Herman Miller, it was to make not just a chair, but to make a sustainable chair, as sustainable as you could. And so that was success, was focusing on that part. Now, down below is a wonderful variation, and also you can read in Charles's handwriting. It is in this area of overlapping interest and concern that the designer can work with conviction and enthusiasm. But note, these areas are not static. They grow and develop as each one influences the other. We actually have this in Ray's handwriting, too. They were both thinking about, we have this one in Charles's handwriting because this is the graphic they kept up at the office afterwards. Now, down here, they took this idea a little bit further, and they would always give the example of working with Herman Miller. That in the production of their furniture with Herman Miller, it had to be called what's called goodness all the way down. That means it has to be good for the company, it has to be good for that person on the line making the furniture, good for the designer, good for the community, and good for the environment. So that's 5 circles. That was, again. Now, I do remember, I really didn't know my grandparents were famous until I saw Ray give a few talks while I was in college, and everyone was surrounding her, and she's trying to take me to dinner. And I was like, oh, okay, this is bigger than I imagined. But she would talk about that it takes 5% of your energy to find an idea that goes in that overlapping circle, but it takes 95% of your energy to keep it in there. That's the hard part, but it's worth it. It's definitely worth it. Here's the leg splint. You have to imagine, for Ray and Charles, they had moved to Los Angeles. Imagine this. So in 1939, Charles and Eero Saarinen are wanting to win the competition Organic Design in 1940. Everybody wants to win this competition because your chair goes into production. Ray and Charles, when they get married and move to Los Angeles in 1941, it's to keep that design going and keep trying. They're at a party in 1942, and a friend of theirs is saying that soldiers being carried off the field, if the splint is made of metal, the wound becomes far worse just in the transportation to the ambulance. So could something be made in wood? And so this is where the origin for the leg splint. So over 100,000 of these were made by 1943 for the Navy, and it was a way to help the war effort without hurting anybody. What they're realizing is you're having to make not just the design, but the machines that make the designs too, which is a very early lesson that they had. In this next one, this is another chair that they designed. This is the airport tandem seating. In the 1950s, in Texas and Washington, D.C., they were asked to design new seating for the airport. Now, the first question my grandparents would always ask, what's already been designed? And why doesn't that work? So they would go and talk to maintenance teams. They talked to a lot of maintenance teams in the work that they did. The maintenance teams at the airports said the problem was the replacement parts. And Ray and Charles are like, well, that's interesting, but what does that mean? And so the maintenance teams explained to them the problems were with the replacement parts. The back and the seat were 2 different shapes. They were heavily upholstered. They took up a lot of storage. And it took 2 or 3 people to pop out the old and put in the new. So if you look at this, the back and the seat are the same shape. That fabric rolls up into a little tube. It takes 1 person and 1 screwdriver to pop out the old and put in the new. Part of what I realized with my grandparents' work is they're just trying to improve and make things easier for people. And they like to be very hands-on and learn by doing. And so it's really, I think, the success of their designs. There's 40 designs in production with Herman Miller, Vitra, and our partners, and it's because they made it easier. This is the National Aquarium proposal. What I love is, for Ray and Charles, it was always about addressing the need, as I said, that they saw or that someone came to them. And not everybody did they work with. Budweiser, which is a beer company in the United States, came to them and asked them to redesign their label for the bottle. Ray and Charles looked at it for a few months. They said it's doing everything it's supposed to do and gave it back. So they didn't work on that one. But for this, when they were asked to design an aquarium, this was to be in Washington, D.C. This was during the Cold War. This is, if you know, when Washington, D.C. was designed to be a diamond shape, this was going to be a diamond at the heart of the diamond. For Ray and Charles, this was, again, a way to bridge communication gaps. This was a way to learn from nature. This was also a way for, as I said, to make the invisible visible. Now, what's interesting is, it may surprise you, or maybe you already know this, Ray and Charles often said, design for someone you love. And it can be you. It can start in your living room. You can see what you know what you want, rather than someone telling you what you need. And for the aquarium, Ray and Charles thought to themselves, what did they connect with these underwater creatures? And they said how they move through the water. So they got 20 saltwater tanks to have at their office, to film the creatures for 2 or 3 years, and to create a proposal to then they could present to the department. Now, they decided they would create a short film, because that meant for 8 minutes, no politician would want to leave the room, because you might step on someone's toes. But if you came in with floor plans and scale models, they might just look at it for 30 seconds and walk away. So this is why you have attention for 8 minutes. But they wanted to have this film footage of these beautiful creatures moving through the water. Now, sadly, it did get nixed, but they created this booklet, which then becomes the template of 2 American museums in the future, which will become the Baltimore Aquarium and the Monterey Bay Aquarium in California. So I love, even if they didn't finish executing something, how these things still lived on long after. What Ray and Charles always said, though, the most important part that they learned was in taking care of the creatures in the saltwater tanks. Any change in temperature or salinity would put the creatures in shock. So they realized that they wanted to be even more sustainable in the production of their furniture, and really thought about not just, what the production of the furniture, but even if it goes in the landfill or something happens, to be as thoughtful as possible. Ray herself will discontinue Brazilian rosewood when she hears how damaging it is to the forest of the harvesting of it. So the sourcing of the materials becomes just as important, or even what happens, because not everyone saves their Eames chairs afterwards. And here's one of those wonderful creatures. How's everyone doing? Good. If someone said, what are you grabbing? These are some of my favorite pieces in the collection. These are parts of the Eames aluminum group chair. When you work in aluminum, you can't carve it. You have to cast something. And these are part of the spreaders in the underside of the chair. Now, when making these, the person in the office who made these, he made 7 of these. And Ray and Charles looked at them, and they picked the first one he made. And he's like, hey, you got 6 more here. And then they said something which he completely agreed with. Because you made those other 6, we know the first one is right. Because what ends up happening is, you can see here, this is the early version. It's a fixed base. But when they start putting this in production, guess what they notice? People want to pivot back and forth. And so that will be the next generation. And that's what's so exciting about the collection, is because we can show this iterative process as they both prototype, but they also learn by doing. They're always testing their furniture, because they wanted to make what they called the best for the most for the least. Now, the other thing is, today, I think being in the San Francisco Bay Area, with so much being digital today, it's really, people are very fascinated with the prototyping in these different materials. I call this 3D printing before 3D printing. And if you were to ask me, Lisa, how many drawings of chairs do you have in the collection? I would say very few. These are their drawings. And they tested, they would make hundreds of prototypes. Something like this wouldn't go into production until they'd made 5,000. They thought that was part of what they called the guest-host relationship. Your job is to anticipate the needs of your client before they've even thought of it, like being a good host of a party. And I know in Barcelona, you guys know how to have a good party. So, and again, so you have to anticipate those needs, and you have to be thoughtful and work with them. There's also a wonderful playful side to my grandparents. They believed in serious play. They worked hard, but they also believed toys are preludes to serious ideas. And what was interesting is, in their travels, they would start noticing there were certain toys they saw in every country that they visited, and tops and kites. Now, they collected these and had them scattered around the office. And we would fly them, we would play with them, but they were reminders of a kind of design where it's designed over generations. Not one person designed either of these. This is something that evolved. You forget that they were ever designed, and they love to have those examples around their office always. I think we got this twice. This is another toy that I love. This is by Enzo Marin from Italy. And I loved how every piece was connected. And Ray, when I was a little girl, would have a whole parade of these animals at the breakfast table to make sure that I ate my breakfast. On the left is a velocipede, which we got to drive around the office, getting to see what was going on. But you know what it also is? There were several, there's another one that I'll show you later. Ray and Charles liked to show their alternatives to fossil fuels. You could pedal around. You could move yourself. You didn't have to be dependent on such things. Now, on the right are toy boats. You may have heard of Toccata for Toy Trains was a film that they made. They were collecting toy boats to make something, another short film. And then this is just part of the collection, but Charles passed away in 1978. I love these drawers that came from the office. I like that one. And then I loved seeing how they actually used the paper in all kinds of ways. And this is one of my favorites. On the toy house. Do you see how they use it? She uses it on the bedding, on the wallpaper, as rugs on the floor. So one of my favorite parts is, as we digitized and cataloged this collection, when I worked in the Mies van der Rohe archive, you were lucky if you had 4 pieces of information for each drawing. You might have a title, dimensions, a number, and a photograph. Today, all of these objects will have over 200 pieces of information. We'll be able to track the location, the materials, the dates, where it might be going out on loan, what publications. And so it's going to be really great to be able to see what patterns we notice between the materials, how things are used in different ways. Does anyone know this, the solar do-nothing machine, or the solar toy? So Alcoa, which is an aluminum company in the United States, reached out to designers and architects across the country and said, show us what you can make with aluminum. Now remember, I said, Ray and Charles said toys are preludes to serious ideas. So they made this wonderful toy. It spins and twirls. It does absolutely nothing fabulously, but it's run by a solar panel. It was a way to introduce this idea of alternatives to fossil fuels, but without saying it. And that's what I love. That's the layering of their work that I still keep learning from. And then some of you might be familiar with Powers of 10. That was the last project I saw them working on. I thought everyone's grandfather went up on a 30-foot crane to zoom in on the panels outside their office. For them, Powers of 10 was a way to connect people through distance. It's not the only way you can connect people, but it's one way is through distance. And you could go from the smallest thing in the universe, which at the time was an electron and a quark. Quarks actually weren't proven at that time, to the largest. It's one with 40 zeros after it. It's exponentially. But again, they were able to connect from the smallest to the biggest. It's still used very much in ways to teach orders of magnitude today at schools. It's one of my favorites. Now, this is our new location. That's what I was telling you about, that we had the exhibit at Oakland. When it closed, this was 6 years ago, that's when I was saying, people said, what are you doing next with this collection? Now, at the ranch, we could only have a certain number of guests. And so at this location, this allowed us to have many more guests to be able to bring our collection, which was actually stored at several facilities in the Bay Area and Southern California, to bring it all more under one roof. So anyone who had seen the collection at the Petaluma, the ranch, saw about 20–30% of the collection. Here they could see 60 to 70%. But it also really allowed our collections team to be able to document, photograph, have guests be able to see it more in person. And also we've been able to do a lot more with schools, to have come over on tours to be able to see the work too. This is when you enter. What's so wonderful, as Anne pointed out, I love it. There's sometimes people know a lot, and there's some that know little about Ray and Charles. But that's my first lesson. They're a working couple. I do get guests who once in a while think they're brothers. Because what happens is if it's a couple, sometimes somebody knows a lot about Ray or Charles, and then the other person doesn't know much. But usually I can bridge those gaps over the course of the tour so everyone can find something to learn from with Ray and Charles. And this is what I'm hoping, is that this is a chance for people to really be inspired by their work and to solve the problems that we have today. It's not that Ray and Charles are the only ones. I just want to add this to people's toolkits for using designs to solve problems. So this is what you see when you enter on the tour. This is the story of the molded plywood. And the reason we have this as the centerpiece when you enter the space is because what Ray and Charles learned from this experience, I've hinted at some of this as we talked, really informs the way they solve problems forevermore. I mentioned that in 1940, Charles and Arrow win that competition Organic Design. So that, you can see just the edge of the red, that chair is from the 1940 Organic Design competition. But there's one problem. It's not supposed to be upholstered. As they said, it hides their mistake. So when Ray and Charles moved to Los Angeles, it's to make the unupholstered wooden chair that should have been made. And these are prototypes here in the front. These are called the Kazam shells because it was magic. You put a flat piece of veneer in the machine and it comes out curved. Now they designed that machine. It's in the upper left-hand corner closed and it's open on the right. And so from this, because they were so hands-on in building this in the second bedroom of their apartment, they're able to test and see that, you know what? The wood is not doing what it's supposed to. And this is why this is really 3D printing before 3D printing. They realized they had entered this with preconceived notions. And so they're trying to make a nice scooped shape, but the wood's not doing. So this is what it's called honest use of materials. And we juxtapose this so you can see with the LCW and the DCM on the right, in 6 years they will split this into 2 pieces to make it more comfortable for somebody to sit. And so these are just some of the stories. And then around here, it's about the leg splints, which I just showed you before. They even tried to take that idea further and make a glider with the molded plywood. That did not work, but they never called something a failure. They always just called it a misconception and moved on. But these pieces, as you saw in those pictures, were around the office at all times because they always felt they could keep learning from what, even if it did not go into production with the 5000. Now this wooden, I would call this a sculpture, but they wouldn't because as they said, we don't do art, we solve problems. That's a material test. It's gorgeous, but it's a material test. They're trying to push the veneer. If you got up close, you would see that veneer is thicker in places and thinner in places. And they're trying to push to see how far they can push this material. That's me on a tour. But what I'm really trying to show you is behind here on the pegboard, we're answering another question. So in this gallery space, we were answering the 3 questions we are most often asked. What was their first project together? That was the molded plywood story. The second question is, what else did they design? So here you have that zigzaggy is from Mathematica. You have a multi-screen presentation, glimpses of the USA up there. You have a wonderful graphic, I'm right in front of it. Charles was asked to leave university when he was studying architecture in St. Louis. And when he told his friend Saul Steinberg that, Saul kindly made him 4 fake diplomas. So that's one of the fake diplomas. And then over here's prototypes. What's really happening is it's only 5 years at the Eames office. All of these projects are happening at the same time. And you can see here. And then over here is the third question we're most often asked. What were Ray and Charles like before they got married? And so over here, we have paintings by both of them. Ray from her Hans Hofmann era, and Charles when he went down to Mexico. We purposely don't have labels because we want people just to experience the material and be very immersed in it. We can look it up later when they can go online and look up specific details of the furniture or the designs of the prototypes. I love that graphic, ABC. It's a wonderful graphic. It's hard to see, but it was actually for a Herman Miller showroom in Los Angeles. But for me, it's a way I can explain to you the relationship between Herman Miller and the Eames family. Are you ready? Good. So, in the middle there, with that big D, that says DJ Dupree. He is the founder of Herman Miller. He names it Herman Miller because that's the name of his father-in-law who gave him the loan to start the company. The reason you have M and H in there is that's Max and Hugh will also run the company. You have Alexander Girard, who will become head of textiles under that 59. You have Ray and Charles Eames, and then you have George Nelson, who introduced Ray and Charles to Herman Miller. Now, when the exhibit comes about, so 6 years in 1946, 6 years after that red chair, there's another exhibit at MoMA in New York. And George Nelson sees that exhibit and writes to Mr. Dupree and says, come to New York, you should see this is what Herman Miller should be producing as furniture. Mr. Dupree goes to New York, he agrees and invites Charles to come talk about mass producing their furniture. And Charles does, but he goes one day before he's expected in Zeeland, Michigan. It's a very tiny town, it's small town outside of Grand Rapids. Many furniture companies are in this part of the Midwest because that's where the hardwood forests were. And Charles goes one day before he's expected. Because he knows it's a small town, most everyone's working at the town, he wants to see what the quality of life is and what people are doing and spending their time. He goes to the graveyard to see if people have time to put fresh flowers on the grave, or is it plastic flowers? He goes to the local bakery to see what kind of bread is at the store. Is it braided loaves of bread or instant bread? And the third place he goes is Frank's the Diner to hear how people talk about the company. And they talk about actually problem solving. So Charles calls Mr. Dupree and calls Ray actually before meeting Mr. Dupree and says, I think this is a company of quality we can work with. They're beautiful fresh flowers on the grave, braided loaves of bread, and people are talking about problem solving. And I always loved that story, and I remembered growing up hearing that story. But what I heard later was George Nelson's side of the story, which he told Mr. Dupree, if you choose not to work with Ray and Charles, they will always be 6 years ahead of us. So it was a good decision all through. And that's what's exciting, is to be able to weave these different stories through the objects in the collection. Then you come here into the collection center. I hope everybody knows, like this chair here is called a DCM. That actually tells you something. That means the seat is dining chair height with a metal base. That red chair up there with a wood base is an LCW. That means the seat is a lounge chair height with a wood base. And then when you're upholstered down there on the end, that's an LCW-2. Lounge chair height with a wood base and 2 pieces of upholstery. So this is, again, we're able to share here about the fact that how they're iterating on these chairs and thinking about there's even consideration of upholstery, but when you start having upholstery, where does the air go when you sit? So then you have a venting issue. So these are what's fun, and everyone connects on these tours in different ways, and we also have broken pieces of furniture. Why would we have broken pieces of furniture? Why would Ray and Charles save it? It was to show Herman Miller where it needs to be better the next time. So that's why we have so many versions. This is a view looking down into the space, and I include this because their office at 901 was very much like this. In this big open space, they could be working on a short film, they could be working on an exhibit, they could be working on just any of the community, architecture, graphics. I mean, it was endless. And it was interesting, when you worked at the office, you may start on one project, but you were working on several at the same time. And then it's the prototypes. This is one of my favorite parts. Again, about not 3D printing. This is prototyping and trying out these different ideas, trying out different bases. They even painted some of the wood silver, so you would have the feel of how it might look like when it's aluminum. And really, they just were constantly testing it. In the office, we actually had chair jigs where you could adjust the height and the angle of the chair. They'd have us all sit in it and see what worked for the best, for the most, for the least. It doesn't get old. And what's also exciting for me is with my colleagues, at the ranch, there was a smaller group that could be working there. Here, we have 25 people coming and working, whether it's from the social media side or it's we're doing an art-directed photo shoot or something like that. Everyone's around the material even more, and so it's great getting different questions or people seeing connections in different ways. Like, for example, I love in this lower right-hand corner, do you see how only the back and the seat are upholstered? Because that's where Ray and Charles are noticing that's the only part of your body that's touching the chair. So that's the only part that really has to have the upholstery. And that brings down the cost because you're not trying to upholster the whole thing. So these little pieces. I love with these tables, the tables actually have the most categories of materials because of the tabletops. And a lot of these tables on display aren't attached to the bases because they were testing them out in different ways. So we have like slate, marble, that's Pyrex right there, laminate. All of this is always testing, testing, testing. I felt like when I visited the office, do you know like with computers, you have A/B testing? Like one little change is made to see if anybody notices it. I felt that sometimes at the office there were little nuances changing, and Ray and Charles were just seeing what made something more approachable, what did somebody feel more comfortable sitting in. At the end of the tour, we have a chair tasting. This is what everyone gets to try the chairs. It's a favorite for everybody, because sometimes somebody hasn't had a chance to see it in the La Chaise, or also this is a Vitra and a Herman Miller. These were both from my mother's living room. This is what my mom liked to have, and these were examples that have been sent. And yes, we have guests. So you get like 2 minutes in each chair, and then we also like watch a film where they ask me questions or something. And it's also back something that Anne says. Everything my grandparents did was participatory. You sat in a chair, you watched a film, you learned from an exhibit. And what's really fun is for Ray and Charles, when they designed their first exhibit, Mathematica, World of Numbers and Beyond, first of all, they did their research. IBM had been asked to make a large donation to a new museum in Los Angeles. They said, we'd rather give you an exhibit by Ray and Charles Eames. Ray and Charles had never designed an exhibit, so they went out to look at natural history museums to see what they could learn from. And what they realized is you can't show everything on a subject, but you can show 6 to 8 to 10 to 12 things that get someone excited enough to learn more. So I'm hoping tonight, some of you want to learn more about Ray painting. Someone else wants to learn about Eames Aluminum Group or the architecture. That's what you can do. And then today, what we're also doing is we realized we were very focused on artifact photography, taking a picture of a chair from each time the same angles, but then we realized we have the material that went into prototyping that material. So like the masks that you see there, we start to create exhibits. And these are the toy boxes that they stored their toys. You can see some more of the ships that they were collecting. We have over 200 boxes of how they collected their toys. They didn't stay in the box. They were used in films. They were used in their House of Cards, a toy that they designed. They also used them in Herman Miller showrooms and even at their own home. So each, again, with these objects, each one has its own life. I do love the circus mirror there. That curved one is a circus mirror. Ray and Charles used circus mirrors at the IBM Pavilion in New York. They designed a bench system, and they have a couple of benches for people to sit on. And then they have a circus mirror. And then they have 3 benches, and then a circus mirror. The benches were for the parents to be able to sit down and figure out where they wanted to go next in the pavilion. And the circus mirror were for kids to make faces at themselves to buy a little more time for the parents to decide where they're going to go. That's the guest-host relationship. This is just the wonderful, what's coming out from some of the drawers. The rulers, they always had 30-foot rulers, both vertically and horizontally in the space at the office, so you had a sense of scale. But you can see that's Ray's handwriting that says toys, to thank, matches, fabrics, the Rebelle. It was magical visiting there. And then there's Ray's handwriting for that overlapping interest diagram. I do love this. So this little box of cigarettes, sometimes I truly wonder, did Ray like smoking cigarettes, or did she like the box that the cigarettes came in? Because she would reuse them to save little scraps. So little scraps was in a drawer called scraps. And so keep repurposing in different ways. And then this was, again, taking some of the toys they collected and using them on the toys that they were designing. Gluing here. I really don't have much to say because it's just so beautiful to look at. And I love seeing it on this big screen because you can really get great detail. And then this is the Eames aluminum group, showing the evolution of that design. You can look at how the base will change, but also the fabric. That fabric on the first one is called saran. It's what they used on cars in the 1950s because it could go indoor, outdoor, and then later evolves to naugahyde and other materials. And then this is, again, carving in the wood, some of those 6 or 7 versions that you heard me describe before. Aluminum was actually interesting because how do you seal the surface was very important. So for them, they were actually getting samples from Boeing that's working on it for airplanes to be able to seal the pieces there. And then these are the toy boxes themselves. And we will, of course, save the boxes. They've become an artifact in and of themselves. This is the conservation. We don't have one conservationist, but we do have, as we notice something needs conservation, then we know who to send it to, because a ray painting is going to be different than a tin toy versus a prototype made of wood or something. So what we're doing is our collection specialist is checking on the condition, and then we're setting aside if something does need some attention. We're also digitizing the collection, and we have an internal, it's called Digital Assets Management. So within our team, if somebody wants to research or plan something, we can share this database internally. Down the road, we're also looking forward to sharing it to guests who want to do research. And then here we're doing the cataloging, what I was saying, for this, we're right now making sure, like, we're photographing them, but also entering, tagging things in different ways to be able to cross-reference everything. So Ray and Charles would often ask themselves, what would Mies van der Rohe say? What would Frank Lloyd Wright say? Every day I think about how can we improve something, how can we do something better, and I think of what would Ray and Charles say. So I thank you very much for getting to share about my grandparents. But I do have a couple of things to ask you students. What I'm hoping you take away from today is really, there's 4 things. I hope you think of the overlapping design diagram, that you really think about addressing the needs of what your clients will be. The big thing is, make no assumptions. Please ground your ideas with facts, get rid of preconceived notions, and really test your ideas. See how well they work. And if it's a surprise, that's fine. It's great to learn and you can do it better and improve upon it. Because just remember, for Ray and Charles, design is a method of action. They called themselves tradesmen, as I said. They wanted the objects to last longer, to make the best for the most for the least. So make it yourself. Try it out. Do not rely on others to tell you how something works. Even if you just build those prototypes, please keep testing them. Always ask what is the need, and has this problem been solved before, and find out how it was, and then you can build on that learning. Iterate, prototype, build it, and try it out for real. If only every design problem were as simple as designing a kite, Ray and Charles said, you know if you have succeeded because either it flies or it doesn't. Thank you. How is it? I'm happy to answer any questions, whatever anyone would like. I love questions. Was this helpful? Yes. Good. Why was it helpful? You probably knew a lot of this already, right? But isn't it fun to see how somebody else does it? That's what I like. And I just hope, part of what I'm hoping is like taking them off the pedestal and just how hands-on they were. And they trusted the process. And that's why that mold to plywood story was so important, because once they did that, they duplicate that every time. And it's just asking a bunch of questions. And I'm so thrilled that you are design and also with engineering. Because you're not just making something just to make something, you're solving problems. And that's really important, because we have so many challenges today. It's really great that you guys are doing that. Yeah, questions? Oh, come on. I see somebody. They're bringing you a microphone.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was amazing to see, like, behind the scenes, the secret life of Ray and Charles and your family. I find it so cool how their aesthetic was really refined and simple, but their inspiration was very eclectic and cool. And I wondered, why do you think they liked the things they liked?
Well, they loved to surround themselves with what they liked, and as we mentioned, the Eames house. What's interesting is when people walk into the Eames house, they would often be like expecting perfectly clear surfaces. And no, they had things that they collected from their trip, things that they were still learning from, and at the office too. It wasn't just for them, but I think it's for us grandchildren and for those who worked at the office. They said it was more important to have less teaching and more found learning. So at the office, what I remember is there were these beautiful 19th century music boxes. They were there because you just wanted to go up and wind it up. They were just gorgeous. But what were they really there for was to show us examples that you don't have to be afraid of machines. That machines can bring you joy. But they didn't say that, but they demonstrated. And I think for them, you know, they loved bringing people together. People came and visited the office and shared whatever, as I said, shared with them also what they were working on. But I think what's incredible is they didn't get to work on every project that they wanted. On Charles's desk was a stack of manila folders about this high, and those were all the projects that they weren't getting to. And I have heard staff members talk about, oh, you know, if you finished a project early, you got to go to that stack, go through it, pick something to work on until you worked on whatever the next project was. I remember walking to my grandfather's office with my mom, and Charles just takes the first folder off the top and opens it. And do you know what it was that they didn't have time to work on? Robert Redford's Sundance Film Festival. This is the 70s. Because they loved that he was thinking sustainably and all that. And I just remember, like, even I knew, like, at 10 years old who Robert Redford was and, like, this thing, but they thought this was great about filmmaking. I mean, that was one of the reasons Ray and Charles moved to LA. It was for two reasons. One, to make that prototype, but also the other reason was to make films about architecture. And I just love that, you know, they didn't silo things. They said to me, you don't have to go to art school to be an artist. Just go do the work. And so that was the only time I would see them frustrated, is when they would say, somebody would talk about an idea and say, oh, I just jotted that down on a napkin. And they'd be like, well, go do it. And the person would be like, I might fail. And they'd be like, well, that's one less misconception if you do it. And so they were just really encouraging. And so I think they surrounded themselves with what they loved. So I consider the collection as what they made, also what they collected, and what they were given. And they kept it all out there, and it was just amazing to walk through those spaces. And that's why my mom saved it all. You know what's a cool thing we're working on now is the library at the office, which is really a reference library for all the shows that they were doing. And we know what was on each shelf, whether it was geography, toys, computers. And so other schools want to know what was on their shelves, like at that time in the 70s, like what were the sorts? It's Google before Google. So, yeah, any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much for this journey to your family in their life. And I think my question would be a little bit related with the previous one. I wanted to know how Ray and Charles have a rest. So how they distracted themselves, because it seems that they were working all the time, working or playing, correctly to say. Mm-hmm. But all creatives are usually overwhelmed, even though it's not deadlines, but probably like the amount of ideas you have and you want to release. But from time to time, we need to distract ourselves just to stop and pause for a minute. Mm-hmm. So if you can, tell us how did they rest, or probably like pause during the day just to distract themselves. Thank you very much.
Sure. There's several stories come to mind. They did love to work hard, like that was a pleasure in itself. You also have to remember it was a time where their clients were east of the Mississippi. So it wasn't like people were dropping in at the last moment. You knew when someone was coming. I mean, they weren't facing that. But I do remember hearing from a former staff, because, we got to go down and visit. Charles was having a cup of coffee. There was a kitchen at the office and sitting at the table. And somebody came over to ask him a question. He's like, no, for the next 10 minutes, this is my cup of coffee. And so they had boundaries, they did, but they also loved their house. They really treated themselves as the client for that case study number 8. And it was really a place to recharge. And really for them, they called it the Skunk Works, which is a funny name, but it was where they could try out ideas by themselves. And what that meant is nobody could criticize you. And for Ray, coming from painting, she would look at something in one way. Charles, coming from architecture, he looked at it differently. And what they said is after a while, you didn't know where one person's idea ended and one started. But that's where the prototyping of the ideas was, that privacy of space and being around the materials. And they did usually take Sundays off. So half days on Saturdays usually, full day on Sunday. But they'd also come up and visit us. I mean, I do remember Alexander Girard, I referenced as head of textiles at MoMA. He had done an exhibit, Textiles of India, in New York at MoMA, and told them the next time in New York, could you photograph it? They did that for many of their friends, and that was a way to see what else was going on in the world. I do love when interviewed in Stockholm, somebody said to them, aren't you happy to see your furniture at the airports and things? And they said, no, we'd much rather see what other people are doing. And I just love that. So does that answer? Good, good. I think there's one more. Do you want to do one more? Is that good? Okay. Okay. Whatever we have time for. I'm all here. Somebody's coming down here. I think I see someone 2 rows. Oh, sorry. Maybe somebody there on the corner there.
Hello, Lisa. Thank you. I would like to ask you, what do you think in terms of sustainability, the future of materials?
I think so. That's what I really want to focus on in our new Richmond space. And even as we reopen the ranch, we're going to be telling more of those stories at the ranch. I mean, they were friends with Buckminster Fuller. They were thinking about, when they were working on a project, what would Bucky say, as I said. And so for them, there's a wonderful quote that Charles wrote, which was, everything was coming at the cost of Lake Michigan. That there were toxins in the soil, pollution in the water, and we had to change our dreams, and we had to think of things in a different way. And this goes back to that guest-host relationship. It's a much larger arc. It's not just thinking about what you're producing, but how that relates to the larger world. And so when they realized that plastic and fiberglass are not good for the environment, they discontinued them. And that's what makes Herman Miller a special company. Because most companies are like, no, no, this is done. You have to keep making it. They were like, no, 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 they want to be sustainable too. Now, the thing is, it's a nice idea to want to be sustainable. It takes a lot of work too. And not for just Ray and Charles, but also for Herman Miller and for Vitra to do those. It takes years to figure out what materials. And now we're even going vegan. I think it's great. I think it's great for everybody. But I think it's a lot of work. And so, but Ray and Charles thought this was important and a priority even during their lifetimes. As I mentioned, Ray discontinued. And then she told Mom, please bring it back when you have an eco-friendly, which is the palisander rosewood, which is what it is today. We do have an eco-friendly version of plastic, but I think it's ongoing, and it's a conversation that has to be had. Ray and Charles knew the world could not sustain, and there wasn't enough leather in the world to upholster all their furniture. So they were thinking about this long before, and I just like highlighting it in different ways through the collection. I can show it. And then people are surprised, and it's fun. Yeah?
Hi.
Hi.
I'm a huge admirer of how they were like multidisciplinary and like their design process. Mm-hmm. But I was wondering, like, how do you think, like, because you knew them personally, like, how do you think they will work or design like nowadays with the technology and like, I don't know, everything?
You know what I wonder sometimes? Would they be designing furniture? because in my lifetime, they were starting to lean more into education and furniture was wonderful and it was exciting and they were working on it, but there were so many ways to use these tools. They saw that computers were an opportunity to handle more information. The problem is humans aren't used to having this much information. And so they felt the systems had outstripped our ability to understand, and we really needed to, it's a way that they put it, like, the structure of the problem will reveal the solution. Because when you have the structure, that means you have all the pieces that need to be there. And for them, it would be a tool. The computer is a tool. I would be curious about what they would say with AI. But at the same time, they would probably be testing it, trying different ideas. I loved that they were doing exhibits when I was growing up, and those were traveling around the world. I mean, can you imagine the learning, helping people learn about math, geography, science? Those are the films that they were making. They made over 120 short films. And so for them, that was, again, a tool to help people. And what was really fun was, like, you didn't have to learn it all at once. You could watch the film again and get a little bit more each time. And so part of their gift was being sensitive to how people learn and how people sat in their chairs. Everything was that guest-host relationship. And so I think there would have been a lot of watching and learning, also working with schools. But I'll never speak for them, but that's what I think about when I fall asleep at night. Yes?
For the wonderful presentation. I'd like to ask, because you mentioned previously that they were very systematic, so I would like to ask if perhaps you could mention what other kinds of systems were essential for their work, maybe from now realizing after taking care of all the archive, or even from some other anecdotes that you might share.
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
I mean, I think for me, a great way to show the system is for Ray and Charles, back to that notion that they never planned to make a chair once. You had to figure out a system to make 100,000 chairs. So they made those first 5,000, and then Herman Miller's helping them scale up. Now, one thing that they did, and the reason there's 750,000 slides, images, and prints, is because Charles's father was a Pinkerton detective who sadly passed away from wounds from a shootout when he was in high school, but wrote mysteries based on his adventures. After his father passed, he went through his father's things and found that his father had wet plate photography in the work that he did. And he had kept the instructions. So Charles in high school taught himself wet plate photography. And then after a year, he discovered that Kodak made film. Now, the reason that's important is because Charles realizes that photography is a tool. And when you're scaling up something from 1 to 100,000, an idiosyncrasy once can be very entertaining and fun and quirky. When you see it 1,000 times, it starts to get annoying. By the time you reach 10,000, you're like wanting to rip your hair out. So for Ray and Charles, the reason they used the photography was they were making sure each of those curves in the chair was not to be fun and quirky, but was about the comfort of the person sitting in there. That's why you see lines of chairs, you see auditoriums, and that they keep honing and iterating on this idea. But that's one example of where they're scaling up. Also, scaling up was through exhibits, like what they were doing, also Mathematica. That first one was so successful in Los Angeles. 2 more are made within 4 years. And so there's 3 sets still in the United States today. And so, again, it was about, how to make this available to more people. That's why, for me, the computer becomes interesting, because I think they would have used that to amplify that even more. Sure. One more? Can I do, Mark, one more? I see a hand there. A microphone, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7th row.
Hello.
Hello.
I would like to ask you about their thoughts about the emotional qualities of the materials, like besides the technical characteristics.
Yes.
Would they appreciate the warmth of the wood,
I could go on and on about this. Like when you look at the back and the seat of the LCW, it's from one sheet of veneer, because you need to have your eye flow from the back to the seat and back and forth. 2, do you remember that white chair called la chaise? When that came in second place, it was actually made of stamped metal. Anyone sit on stamped metal? it's very cold and uncomfortable. And so then they try to make it in a tile or something that is more comfortable when you sit in it. When they're making the chaise, they coat the base so that the cold doesn't transfer to your back. They were very thoughtful in the materials and in testing to see what worked. And they often would drop these off with friends' houses, like the lounge chair and ottoman. And the story that I heard was one of their friends was asleep when they came back to pick it up, and they knew they nailed it. But it was really, that's part of it, and that's part of the reason why I love the materials, you know? And those were 5 new materials getting used in a whole new way for people, and that's why they had to demonstrate that these were things that were gonna last. What do you think? Thank you. Thank you very much. And come visit Richmond. Come and see. Come see with the archive and in person.